All the parts for the interior now received their main and secondary colors, and now I needed to add a lot of detail. First, starting it off by adding a lot of carbon fiber decals all over the place, the center console, the door handles, and a lot of the trim pieces on the dashboard as well. Now before I could do that, I obviously needed to make some templates so that I knew what shape the carbon fiber decals needed to be. So I just placed a piece of tape over the parts that I wanted to copy, or at least wrap in some carbon fiber decals, then traced the edge with a permanent marker, transferred it to the piece of carbon fiber decal, cut it out, and started applying the decals to those specific pieces. After soaking the decal in some water and having it removed from the backing paper, I applied some decal setting solution from Microscale Industries to the part that the decal needs to be applied to. This helps to form and helps to stick the decal a little bit better to the part, and then just heat it up, add some more decal setting solution on top to form it even more, help it a bit with a Q-tip, and for those final pieces I also used some decal sol. This is a softening solution for the decals to form even more to the parts if the setting solution is not strong enough. So just apply it a couple of times, add some more of the decal solution, give it some heat with a hairdryer to dry it up a bit and speed up the process, and use a Q-tip very carefully to form it into some tighter spaces. After finishing off that center console, I moved on to the steering wheel, which needed some carbon fiber as well on the bottom, some of the middle pieces around the airbag and the horn, and also on the top piece of the steering wheel. I made a quick template of the bottom piece, transferred that to the decal, and started forming it to the piece with some decal settings, some decal softening, and some Q-tips. After a couple of very careful and tiny relief cuts, the piece formed even better around the steering wheel, added some more softening solution and some heat, and it completely conformed around it perfectly to shape. The steering wheel and center console are now finished, so I needed to move on to the biggest piece, and that is the dashboard. This consisted of a lot of different small pieces, so I added some masking tape, traced it around with the permanent marker, and moved it over to the decal sheet, cut the various parts and pieces out, and started applying them. A lot of the buttons and trim pieces in the interior needed some chrome surrounding them, so I first applied some chrome with the Molotow chrome paint pens, and then later filled it in for the rubber button pieces or the vents with some black paints with a brush and some toothpicks, leaving a chrome edge and a rubber or just matte black centerpiece. chrome is now applied to the edges of the buttons and the trim pieces, so I could now fill in the centers with some black and paint the centers of the vents with some black as well. On the dashboard, the top of the gauge cluster and the edges around it needed to be painted flat black, so while I had it in the brush anyway, I went to town on that as well. The centers of the seats had a contrasting gray line in between them, so I mixed up some black with some white to make it a custom gray and painted those on by hand. The Manatino on the steering wheel needed a silver dial around it, so I applied the silver with a toothpick and also painted the silver on the start-stop button as a lighter base for the red that I will apply later on. Since the rear half of the floor pan is covered with the molded in seat halves, I only needed to apply some flocking to the first or the front part of the bucket for the interior, so I just applied some black enamel paint from Humbrol, applied the flocking on top of it, and moved on to the other side, finishing it completely off with the first half flocked and looking like a nice gray dark black carpet. As I said earlier, some parts were painted silver for a lighter base, and then later painted with a red permanent marker to simulate a sort of anodized candy apple red over a silver or metallic button. The start-stop button is just pure red, so I applied some light red from Vallejo with a toothpick and moved on to applying some of the decals for the dials in the gauge cluster. A Ferrari logo was placed on the dashboard and also on the steering wheel. In the headrest there is a contrasting Ferrari prancing horse stitched into it, but there were no decals in a contrasting gray and some metal emblems would look too shiny, so I just mixed up some paint and very carefully touched it up with a fine brush. The final details now have been done, so that is all completed. All that was left to do now is assemble everything, just using some regular Bob Smith Industries super glue. The interior was a lot of work, adding those details to the door cards and adding the carbon fiber decals to all those intricate pieces. It took quite some time, but after finishing it all off, adding those details, it really turned out like a pure gem, and I'm really happy that I could simulate the actual interior as close as I did in this piece. Now in the final video, the slideshow, I will be showing some comparison shots with the actual interior and actual car to see how close I actually got to it. For now, that's it, and we're moving on to the next part, and that is probably finishing off the body and the entire build in the next video.